this video, I'm going to take you through how to close a gap in your finance plan so that you can move your film into production. Now, when you understand how to do this, you're never going to waste time again wondering how to inch your film closer to production. And make sure you stick around until the end because I'm going to give you some actionable steps that you can take from this video in order to decrease that gap, finance your film, greenlight it, and get into production. All right, so let's get started. Now, number one is just looking at, well, what is a gap in your finance? So a gap is really just the difference between your total budget, so the budget you need to make the film, and the finance that you currently have. So if you've gone out and raised a bunch of finance, but it's not quite enough to cover your whole budget, you have a gap. Now, this term gap and gap financing is something that's thrown around quite a bit. And so I just want to kind of demystify something about it and also speak to gap financing because this is how I think you shouldn't approach closing a gap. So you should never start out with a strategy of having a gap in your finance plan. So you don't want to try and raise like 90 or 95% of your film's finance and then rely on gap financing to close finance on your film. Now, why is that a bad strategy? The reason it's a bad strategy is because gap financing is typically offered by film financiers, so film funds, and they really only provide gap financing when you have contracted pre-sales in place. So that means that your sales agent has gone out, they've sold the film, they have contracts for those sales equal a total amount, and then a film finance company is agreeing to lend you that money to basically finance the gap, and it's using those pre-sales as its collateral. So the reason that this is not a good strategy, particularly if you're making an independent film or one of your first few films, is because to get pre-sales, particularly in this market, you need A-list talent. And so it's unlikely that you're going to have the level of cast that you need to get pre-sales that will then even make gap financing an option. So, hot tip, don't put gap financing in your finance plan and don't rely on it as a way to finance any portion of your finance plan. So, how do we approach it? Well, you'll be glad to know that there are only two ways to close a gap on a film and get it into production. Number one, you can decrease your budget. Number two, you can increase the amount of finance that you've raised. So let's talk about this because when you understand this, it really makes it simple to just look at any film that you're working on, any film that you're trying to finance and go, okay, the only way that I can finance this is to decrease the budget or increase the finance. They're your two options. Now, what typically happens is it's a combination of these two things that gets a film over the line, right? So if you're like 70, 80, even 60% there, maybe even lower, it's usually just a combination of bringing more money in, decreasing the budget, and then at one point, everything aligns. So let's talk about how to decrease your budget, and let's give you some actionable steps that you can take away and start doing that today. So there are really 4 ways that I would look at decreasing your budget in order to really move the needle. So we're not looking at trying to save a few $100 or a few $1,000 here or there. We're trying to make big savings, really move the needle and decrease the budget dramatically in order to push the film into production. So number one is you cut the shoot days. So each day that you're in production is typically costing you tens of thousands of dollars. So if you can just lose one day of production, that's going to be a significant saving in the budget. Now, the best way to do this is to really firstly get a first AD to schedule the film properly so that you know that any schedule that you've put together is accurate, right? Maybe you've actually overscheduled it. So that's the first step. Now, if that's already done, really the best way to cut days is to cut page count in your script, right? That is the best way to decrease the amount of days. You go back into the script and you look at how can we make this leaner? How can we tell this story basically with less pages? right? How can we trim it, make it leaner, but still achieve what we're trying to achieve with it creatively, right? Still tell the story that we're trying to tell, still convey the central theme or the premise of the film. So we're not trying to compromise that, but we're looking at whether we can do it in a much leaner, simpler way. So that's the first thing that you want to do. Now, sometimes when you go back to the script, you might see that it's actually not formatted properly. So a quick tip is to go back, format your film properly. Sometimes that actually decreases the page count much more than you might think. And so that's a really quick, easy way to do it. If you're further along though, and the schedule is very much based on the script and the scenes, then cutting the page count is the way to go. Now, second way to do it is to limit big set pieces. So you want to have a look at all of your scenes, particularly those that include action, stunts, and VFX. Those are going to be the areas that you spend the most money on. And if you can find a way to execute that scene without having to rely so heavily on those things, then it's going to decrease the budget for that particular scene. And so other things that you might include in there, makeup, particularly like prosthetics or SFX. And the other one was nighttime shoots, right? Nighttime shoots are expensive. You got to pay loadings. So you want to try and find ways to get around having these big set pieces where you're essentially like adding elements onto the scene. So you have your core crew, but are there scenes where you're having to add elements on there? And if there are, how can you do those differently? Next one is to cut characters. So simply by cutting the amount of actors that you're going to need, particularly those who have speaking roles, that is going to save you a lot of money. Now, what usually happens with cutting characters is it's more often a case of combining characters. So you want to look at, are they just characters that you have that are serving the same purpose, and that if combined could still serve that purpose without losing anything? So maybe you have like one too many antagonistic forces, right? And maybe you could combine those into one antagonistic force. Maybe there are like some support characters that, again, they are supporting the story in some way, but they could be combined. You actually don't need all of them. So you want to go through and really examine the script and examine those characters and see if you can combine any. If you can cut any, great, that's even better. But if not, see if you can combine. And then the last way is to cut locations. So just look at the amount of locations that you have, try and limit that, or try and use certain locations in more than one way. Because again, if you're moving unit a number of times, that is going to increase your costs. A big one with locations is also looking at, are you shooting the film outside of the city? So if you are doing that, you want to have a look at, is there any way to bring scenes or part of the shoot back into the city so that you're not incurring the costs of travel and accommodation? And you also want to look at whether you can bring the whole film within a radius that still makes it a city shoot where you're not having to accommodate people. You know, maybe it's still like 30 or 40 minutes out of the CBD, but it's not like 2 hours out. So people can go back and forth for the shoot. They don't have to be housed, outside of the city. So those are really the 4 areas, and starting at the top, that's where you're going to make the most savings. So it's just cutting shoot days. Then it's limiting those big set pieces, cutting characters, and cutting locations. Now, let's talk about increasing finance. So if you've already raised finance and you have a gap that you need to close, there are 4 ways that you can do this. And again, I would do this in order of priority. So number 1 is to go back to the investors, the private investors that have already committed to the project, and see if they would be willing to invest more into the project, either to fully close the gap or to part close the gap. Now, the reason that you want to do this is they've already said yes to the project. They're committed to the project. They want to see it go into production. They might also have other people that could invest, but those are the people who have the most incentive to help you get this film financed. And so you want to go back to them as your first port of call. Second one is to ask for more money from the sales agent or distributor who's attached to the project. So again, they've already assessed the project, they've already said yes, they're already putting up some money. And so if they can see that you only need a little bit more to close finance, they may be able to help you there. If not, they may know people who can help, right? So they're a really great resource for finance as well. The next option is to reinvest your fees, so part of your fees and the overheads that you're claiming as a production company into the project. So you can look at the total fees that you're getting, the total overheads, and you can consider whether there's a portion of those that you're willing to invest into the film that can go into the finance plan, basically just help you close the finance and move it into production. And then the last way is to look for soft money. Now, the reason this is last is that grants can typically take a long time to, number one, apply for, and number two, to receive. So the other options are a much faster way to close finance, but grants are another great way to do it because it's essentially free money. So you do want to look at whether there are any options out there for grants, for soft money that you can use to help you just close the film and get it over the line. And obviously if your film already has a bunch of finance in place, then your application for that grant is going to be much more attractive than a lot of other projects. So that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you on the next one.